Did we lose everything?
Yeah.
Oh.
Do you need water?
I'm okay, thank you.
Okay.
We're good? Good morning again.
Come on.
Anybody need water?
Today we're going to talk about an awful word in most of our eyes. Okay? Anna knows this one best. That's actually me, I should say. The word I'm going to talk about today is submission. I knew I would get a look. I'm going to be reading out of 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 through 25. You know, when Moses was leading the exodus from Egypt, God called the children of Israel a stiff-necked people. Things have not changed much. We often find it hard to bow to someone else's wishes, wants, or ways. We don't want anyone to tell us what to do. We want to do it our own way. Just the word submission raises the hair on the back of our necks. Our first response is, I don't have to do what you say. But Peter says that submission is a part of the Christian life and gives us the ultimate example of submission in Jesus. At the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, Peter talks about the relationships that we have. And in all of them, he urges us to be submissive. In relationship to the government and the rules, he tells us in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 14, he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Then there's marriage. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, it says, wives, in the same way submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. And in verse 7 it says, husbands, in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect. And then finally, Peter mentions the relationships within the church. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, it says, finally, all of you be like-minded. Be sympathetic. Love one another. Be compassionate and humble. Peter urges us to be submissive. But why? In the middle of these passages on relationships, Peter talks about Jesus. He tells us that Jesus is the ultimate example of submission and that we are to follow the pattern set by Christ. First thing I want to talk to us today is the priority of submission. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 25 tells us, for you were like sheep going astray, but now that you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Peter says that we were called to submission. You know, we talked about last week in Luke chapter 9, the message of Jesus is that you must be submissive to him to follow him. You have to be fit for service. Dietrich Bonhoeffer begins his book, The Cost of Discipleship, with these words, cheap grace is the deadly enemy of our church. We are fighting today for costly grace. Bonhoeffer wrote those words in the 1930s, and they still ring true today. Peter says that if we call ourselves Christians, then we are called to be submissive. We are called to submission. If we think we can pledge our allegiance to Jesus but not submit to his lordship, we cheapen the grace of God. When Bonhoeffer says the enemy of the church is cheap grace, he's talking about the lack of submission. I'm often shocked to discover people who complain about how hard life is and then in the next breath say, I thought following Jesus would be easier than this. What they mean is that I thought I could live without submission. I thought I could continue to do what I want to do, but be saved from the end game. Dr. Stephen Olford makes a profound statement. If Jesus is not Lord of all, then he is not Lord at all. I'm going to say it again. If Jesus is not Lord of all, then he is not Lord at all. Peter says if you call yourself Christian, then you are called to submission. We don't have a choice. You do have a choice, but it's the wrong choice. I want to talk now about the path of submission. You going to unplug us? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 through 23, it tells us, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to who judges justly. But how do we live submissive lives? Peter defines a submissive life by the example of Jesus. According to Peter, submission is not retaliating for wrong suffered. It's not saying one thing but then doing something else. Submission is not vowing to get even or threaten to return suffering. Oftentimes, in the high-pressure world of politics and business, the motto is to get them before they get you. Make sure you take care of number one. I've heard people talk about why their marriages fell apart. They talk about how the other person didn't make them feel something anymore. Or they wanted something else. I've heard people complain about preaching, that it's too dry, too long, too short, too shallow, too deep, too many illustrations, but not enough illustrations. And all of that was from the same Sunday sermon. In business, politics, marriage, and the church, if we are not careful, everything will center on how it benefits us. It's easy to become a stiff-necked people who scream, I am in control and I will get what I want. In the Old Testament, there was lex talionis, the law of the claw. Just states that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You ever looked at the talons on an eagle or a hawk? They could inflict some major damage. Most of us live by the law of the claw. If you hurt me, then I'll sink my claws into you and hurt you back. Jesus addressed the law of the claw. He said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, give to the one who asks of you, and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. But what if they are mean? What if they can't be trusted? Do you know what they have done in the past? Jesus tells us not to repay evil with evil, because the ends do not justify the means. Peter points out that these are not just words to Jesus. When he endured the agony of the cross, he was beaten, mocked, tortured, humiliated, and killed. For what? Pontius Pilate said that he found no fault in Jesus. A man who had done nothing wrong suffered a horrible, gruesome punishment, yet he did not demand his way. Paul says that he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus tells us to be submissive, and then he models the submissiveness as he suffers and dies on the cross. If you're like me, everything in you says that's not fair. And you know what? You're right. It's not fair. Peter points out that the object of our submission is God, not the figure before us. He says that Jesus submitted himself to the one who judges justly. That is God. If you spent very much time around children, you know that one of their favorite phrases is, "That's not fair," which is usually followed by a temper tantrum, right? For Charlie, it's rambling right now, and then a temper tantrum. He can't quite get the words out, but that's not fair. You would think things would change as we get older, but sadly, it does not. We've become a nation that screams, "That's not fair." If things don't go our way, or we think that we have been mistreated just a little bit, we have to cry, "That's not fair." But instead of throwing temper tantrums, now we file lawsuits. And the church isn't any better. There's jealousy, bitterness, anger, backbiting, slander, gossip, and all forms of dissension. And I know it sounds like a broken record, but let me tell you why. Years ago, something happened that I didn't think was fair. To be honest, I don't even remember what it was. You see, that shows you how big the deal it is. It's not very big. If you can't remember what it is, it must not have been that big. Anyway, complaining to God about how I was being treated fairly, or I was not being treated fairly. I said, "God, it's not fair." But it wasn't fair for God's Son to die for my sins either. You see, he did nothing wrong. I did. It was then that I realized an important lesson. I only cried "not fair" when I got the short end of the stick. I never shouted "not fair" when I got what I did not deserve. Mercy is not getting what you deserve, and grace is getting what you do not deserve. And both are not fair. But we don't complain when we receive God's grace or mercy. We don't serve God so that we can be guaranteed fair treatment. And if you do, you're in it for the wrong reason. And if you found it, let me know. If I could just shout that I'm a follower of Christ and I would be treated fairly, I'd be all about it. But that's not how it works. It's not life. I'm not a Christian because I want to be able to get even with somebody else for hurting me. I follow Jesus because I realize that his love for me is so great that he died for me, and that without him, I would be eternally lost. The greatest gift that I have ever received was an unfair gift that cost Jesus Christ his life. So the next time that we are treated unfairly, think about how they treated Jesus. The next time you want to cry, "That's not fair," think about how Jesus died unfairly for our sin. It's not about fairness, it's about gratitude. Fairness is about ourselves. Gratitude is about submission. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, it tells us, "He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed." Jesus endured his suffering for us. It was his submission that purchased our salvation. Peter tells us that to follow the example of Jesus, as we submit to God, God can use our example to reach others. Do you know the type of witness that you could have if you did not demand fairness, but we lived in submission to God? Now compare that witness with the one that you would have if you demanded your own way all of the time. The opposite of submission is control, and the opposite of humility is pride. Peter says that by his wounds we are healed. How are things at work in your marriage, in your church? Could you use some healing? You see, Peter makes it clear that healing does not come by trying to control the situation or by prideful demanding of your own way. Healing comes when we submit to God and we allow his Spirit to work. By submitting to God, we allow him complete control of our lives. As he works in us and through us, we will also see him working around us. And where God works, there is healing. Where God works, there is life and there is restoration. You see, our submission is not to others. It's to God, so that he can use our lives to touch the lives of others. Because Jesus submitted and you and I have salvation. If you and I submit, God can work through us to change governments, to change workplaces, to change homes, to change churches. The purpose of submission is so that God can change the things around us by changing us and then working through us. So that awful word, submission, we run away from it. We dread it. We try to ignore it. But once we see the submission of Christ and we realize that we are called to live like that, submission goes from awful to filling us with awe. Because of the submissive example of Christ, my life will never be the same. Have you accepted the unfair gift of Jesus, that he would die in your place? If you haven't, that's still something that you can do. I'll close with this. Because of the example of Jesus and how he has changed my life, I want God to use my life to reach others. So we submit to him. We allow him to work in me, through me, and around me. But the question is, what is your desire? Do you want your way, or will you give up your demands and even your freedoms so that God can use you to touch another life? Will you submit to God? Ms. Cass is going to lead us in a ministry time of worship. If you would like to talk with someone, pray with someone, or you just want somebody to listen to what you have to say, you can give us a call anytime. 706-570-1372. I really appreciate everybody tuning in this morning, and I love you.